Well, hello everybody. Max of Pilots and Prop Wash. I hope everybody's doing well. I am very happy to say that the Pilots and Prop Wash video on the pilot shortage has gotten a considerable amount of viewership and generated a lot of comments. So I thought perhaps I'd do a part two to address some of the issues that were brought up in the comment sections of the first video. The biggest one probably being that a lot of people feel that there is no pilot shortage. And in raw numbers, that's true. However, for the airlines, they have a looming problem not only with not enough people in the training pipeline for the future, but also whether or not those people meet the personality profile that they're looking for. Now, I should add that I did pilot recruitment for 3 years, and although most of the people we interviewed were recommended for hire, there are a few who were not. And at our airline, you basically had the job until you talked yourself out of it, but a couple of people did. Perhaps at some point in the future, I'll do a video on a handful of do's and don'ts at airline interviews that are pretty basic, but you'd be surprised that some of the people told us, and a lot of that was simply because they weren't prepared for the interview. Now that brings up the quick issue of the pilot personality profile and the relatively short period of time the airline has to observe you and decide whether or not you fit that profile. Now, some things like logbooks they can simply look at, but they only have a short period of time where they're sitting across the table from you to try and figure out if you're going to be a good fit for their company. And I can assure you there are some people who simply don't fit the corporate mold. And like it or not, if you're going to be an airline pilot, the corporate mold is exactly what you have to fit into. Remember, it's a business. Although under PREA, the Pilot Records Information Act, the airline can see how many failures you've had on check rides, and basically if you've been in any trouble, they cannot actually tell anything about the quality of your work at the airline outside of that. For example, if you had a tendency to show up late for work, or were a no-show, or somebody that called out sick a lot, all of this information is pretty well protected. Normally, when they contact your previous employer, the only thing they will get is a confirmation of the dates that you worked there. The airlines don't want to risk getting sued, so they pretty much don't say anything else other than Pilot Smith flew from this month to that month. Quite often, they won't even mention if you were terminated out of fear of a lawsuit. This is one of the main reasons that being currently employed is so important to a future employer. So to qualify a point that was made earlier, and which quite a few people pointed out in the comments section, what there's really a shortage of is 5,000 plus hour regional airline captains who are currently working with an excellent background, no pink slips or failures in their background, nothing that would crop up on PREA, and a solid track record of at least 5 years with the airlines. Now that dovetails nicely into the next point that was made by quite a few people, and that is a lot of people, not necessarily just young ones, do not want to put up with the abuse that goes with being both a flight instructor and a regional airline pilot, and that's after considerable expense. So let's take a quick look at what life was like for me 30 years ago when I got into the industry and a pilot today. When I started getting into this industry over 40 years ago, it was not as expensive as it is now, even adjusted for inflation. So the money is definitely one thing that drives a lot of people away. The upfront costs are terrible. The days of going to the local airport where the nice little old lady behind the counter has an instructor give you an introductory ride for $10 are gone. And don't think that doesn't have an impact on people. It's extremely intimidating to go into a large flying school with dozens of aircraft and a cold corporate nature. It's not exactly enchanting. Another aspect is the pay and the abuse. When I got in the industry, and again we're going back to the 1980s, basically abusive work conditions and low pay were all considered part of the job, getting your feet in the door. Your first job as a flight instructor was an apprenticeship to get you up to be a charter pilot, which was your apprenticeship to get you to be a regional airline, or back then commuter airline first officer, which was the abuse you put up with to become a commuter airline captain. All of these were basically considered steps in an apprenticeship so that you could get hired at a major airline. And when you started off the major airline, life was rough because it was still somewhat lowish pay and a pretty rough schedule. But all of this was considered part of climbing the ladder to where you could get your seniority and start making the big bucks. It was a commitment, much in the vein of medical school or law school, Becoming an airline pilot was a commitment in time, resources, and of course, sacrifice. Some of this was motivated by prestige, some by money, and some by a love of aviation. Despite all of this, some people felt that pilots were a bunch of underworked, overpaid playboys, which sadly also attracted a certain element of people. Some of them didn't last once the harsh realities became apparent to them, but others stuck with it because, as they would say in poker, they were pot committed. They had too much invested not to do it now. There's all kinds of people in aviation. This entire situation came about as a result of Business 101. You have pilots who have their wants and needs. You have the business community, in this case the airline management, which has their wants and needs. And then you have what the market will allow. And these groups have to find that overlapping area in the Venn diagram where they can all be satisfied. Failure to find these sweet spots results in strikes, bankruptcies, mergers, and liquidations. Nowhere has that been greater displayed than in the post-deregulation era, but that's another video. But for the future, the problem is not the physical number of pilots. It's the number of pilots that fit the corporate mold, that have the requisite experience, and are willing to put up with the abuse. And as I mentioned in the previous video, a lot of that is generational, and the simple fact is a lot of young people look at it and simply go, no, I think I'll do something else. And this is not something aviation has had to wrestle with much in the past. There were always plenty of young people who were in love with aviation, the glamour, perhaps the money, or just the love of flying, that were willing to fill the ranks and put up with the abuse. But every generation is different, and the current generation, not so much. And that is where the pilot shortage for the airlines really comes from. It's not so much a number of people who know how to fly as the number of people who fit the mold. I know a lot of people who have interviewed multiple times at multiple airlines and not gotten hired for multiple reasons. Of course, this too has changed over time as the qualifications and backgrounds of pilots have changed. It was easy to find pilots in 1975, in fact, too easy. The Vietnam War had just ended. There were all kinds of jet-rated guys floating around with military backgrounds. The airlines had a pretty good idea of what they were getting before they even met the person. That's just not the case anymore. Although there's still plenty of military pilots getting hired, they make up a smaller subsection simply because modern aircraft and the military are so capable they just don't have to train as many pilots, and the military has offered more incentives for them to stay in at least until retirement. In fact, we probably hire as many military retirees as we do people who are ending their active service. The regional airlines are still a great source of pilots, and some could argue that they're really the ones that are hurting. But it's all part of a train. Stop one car and the whole train stops. So from the airline industry's point of view, it's not so much that there's a shortage of currently trained pilots as there is a shortage of candidates for the projected future. The industry uses this as an excuse to go to the single pilot cockpit, but in reality that's really just more of a cost savings thing. After all, they are a business and profit is their ultimate intention. Let's not be naive about that. But the cockpit is not the only place that this is happening. There is a real shortage of air traffic controllers happening right now, which has actually manifested itself as a slowdown in the number of aircraft that some airports can take. I've personally experienced that. There's also a shortage of A&P mechanics, and according to some factories, of qualified workers to work in factories. This again gets back to a cultural shift. A lot of schools have gotten rid of their shop classes. Young people are often really not taught to think in the ways of the trades. This is a point that's been brought up by a great many people and is true, and it's affected the cockpit as much as anything else. So is there a pilot shortage? Well, it depends on how you define it. Just to reiterate the point, there are probably plenty of pilots out there in raw numbers, but that doesn't mean they're the kind of people that fit the corporate mold and would do well in the airline industry. If I had to sum it up in a few words, times change. Well, guys, thanks for all of the comments and everything, both agreeing, disagreeing, critical. I'd love to encourage conversation. I try to read them all, and a lot of you guys have made some great points down there. So keep up the good work. We'll talk at you later. Blue skies and tailwinds.